Depression, we're going to do several things today. First off, we're going to talk about what is depression. We're going to talk a little bit about types of depression, then treatments for depression, and then the spiritual aspects of how we as the church can be effective in dealing with people who struggle with depression. Now, I made the decision early on in my professional career that I was not going to hide the fact that I have been touched by depression for most of my life, and that I'm on medication, and it has helped me tremendously, eventually. And I've been through many different aspects of what depression brings to people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I experienced in my life. I'm not a neuropsychologist or physiologist, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not a psychologist. I'm a clergy person, specially trained to be a chaplain, and have been a chaplain for 20 years. At least. I've also been a parish pastor in several different settings. I've always concentrated my work in the area of bereavement, working with people who have lost loved ones to death. And as you might guess, quite frequently you run into aspects of depression in a situation like that. But in my own situation, I can't really point to anything extraordinary in my life that I can say, well, that's where my depression came from. But I do believe that I was touched by it since pre-adolescence. I can remember some of the experiences and thoughts and feelings that I had as young as 6, where I didn't really know that I was different from other people, because I believed that pretty much everybody else felt the same thing, and there was nobody to tell me anything different. The images and the feelings that come back to me are the sense of being different from other people, set apart from other people, and a profound loneliness. Although I got along well with everybody around me, including other children, going even up through high school, you might even say I was popular, but that did nothing to alleviate the loneliness. Also, there were attendant behaviors that at the time nobody understood. It also was true that I had attention deficit. I didn't have the hyperactive component. I wasn't up bouncing around all the time. My mouth was. I was known for telling stories and arguing with the teachers. But the blessing was that I was charming. So I could argue with the teachers and make them smile at the same time, which was lucky for me. One of the things that I dealt with a great deal was tic disorder. If you're not familiar with tic disorder, when we talk about tics, we're talking about sudden involuntary movements or sounds. And I did all of those things. It is a compulsion. Anxiety begins to build up inside you, and unless you do something that you're familiar with that relieves those feelings, it's a horrible experience inside. Now, when I say things that relieve that feelings, typically they're noise making, or grimacing, or jerking. You're probably all fairly familiar with Tourette's syndrome. It's been suggested that I probably had a mild case of Tourette's, although I didn't blurt out obscene words or anything of that nature. I did grimace, and sometimes I had to contract all the muscles in my body to relieve the anxiety, but it would only be for a few minutes. That was a source of amusement to my brother, to see me do that. It was a source of irritation to my parents. And I was reprimanded because everybody just assumed that I was seeking attention. And I didn't understand it myself. Everybody told me I should be able to control that. But I couldn't. Yet I held myself responsible. I was, in some ways, unacceptable because I did these things. And that added to the loneliness and the sadness. This was true up through high school. It's true today. I still have tics. But they're so minor, and I've learned to control them so well that most people don't realize it. I still do noise-making tics. Usually when I'm tired, and there's a reason for that. And it's related to depression. It's related to a bunch of other things when we get to talking about the biochemistry. As a teenager, I was suicidal. I was not actively suicidal in the sense that I was seeking a way to kill myself, but my thoughts were filled with how I might kill myself. It's not unusual for teenagers to engage in a dramatic, and as I look back at some of the thoughts that went through my mind, I was always thinking of dramatic ways to end my life. For some reason, I never did attempt to follow through on any of those things. I think I was afraid. But I thought about it a lot. My self-esteem was pretty much in the tank, which was the paradox to the image that I presented. Because, like I said, I was popular. People liked to hear me tell stories and tell jokes, even the teachers. I remember one time I was gathered with the other students in the hallway in high school, and I don't know what I was doing. I was probably telling a dirty joke. And I noticed the principal standing on the outside watching me. I said to him, "Mr. King, I'm doing nothing wrong. I'm pure." And he said, "I'm just trying to decide pure what." So I got away with a lot of things. But that outside, that appearance was what I had learned to do in order to be acceptable. Because I didn't think I was acceptable. I wasn't good enough. And I'm going to talk a little bit about spirituality here too. We were a family who attended worship regularly. I was a person whose thoughts went to the theological just because I found it interesting. And my father was very much philosophical. And we would have long discussions about these things. In that time period, pre-adolescence, adolescence, it was my belief that I had no doubt that God loved me, but that was because God had to love me. That was God's job. But that I was not an easy or a pleasant thing to love. It's kind of like holding a dirty diaper. Somebody's got to do it. And that God loved all of his children, but he loved the good children best. And again, God couldn't be wrong. So the problem was with me. And I looked upon God as being one who maybe grudgingly accepted me and loved me. And that I needed to raise the bar on my own behavior and who I was inside. Again, tremendous responsibility. Tremendous responsibility. And I didn't find much comfort in my faith because I looked upon it as being a responsibility, as being just one more evidence that I wasn't what I should be. In terms of academics, I was called an underachiever, which I was. My mother's favorite mantra was, "You could be an A student, if you wanted to. And about my sophomore year, it suddenly struck me, I don't think I want to. I don't want to be an A student. I was the joke of the school, not in a mean way, that you had to be very careful opening my locker. Because if you opened my locker, things jumped out at you. I would throw things and slam the door shut. I was notorious for this. Any space I occupied, I made a mess. A terrible mess. And it was known throughout the school. All of these things, I couldn't figure out why I was that way, but I was that way. And again, obviously, it seemed like I just didn't care. But I did. I wanted to be able to do things the way other people did it. But again, I had no other alternative than to believe what was being told to me is you could do it if you wanted to. You have the capability of doing that. Because I was a paradox. I was getting F in 2 9-week sections of geometry. F for both 9 weeks. And then the 2 nights before the semester test, I read the book and I got a B+ on the final test. Really made the teacher angry. But he didn't want to go with me again for another 9 weeks, so he gave me a D-, for the semester score. I wasn't stupid. And I applied myself, which I could do in short bursts if I was interested in what I was doing. I could do it, and I could do it well. And this was my whole life up through seminary. There wasn't a paper I wrote that I didn't write the night before the day that it was due. I would promise myself I would never do that again. But I found myself doing it again and again and again, and every time, I would feel horrible. I just proved this is who I am. But I didn't want to be that way. I was helpless. Needless to say, back in the 60s, when I was a teenager, nobody knew anything about attention deficit disorder. You were just the class clown, or you were the class troublemaker. You just didn't pay attention. You didn't care. You were an underachiever. And equally, nobody talked about depression. Nobody knew what depression was. And if they talked about anything that dealt with mental disorders, it was done with maybe an unintentional but present nonetheless accusatory. What is wrong with you that you have this to deal with? Why don't you help yourself? You know, I've always been overweight. Well, that's not true. I've been overweight in different sections of my life. But a good portion of it. And my brother was 2.5 years older than me. Of course, he's got the body of a Greek god. That really helped. But he's only about 5'8". Anyway, he's 65 now, and he really does have the body of a 30-year-old. He's got the six-pack, and he doesn't work out. He can eat anything he wants. It just makes me sick. One day we were in a restaurant or something, and he said, "Why don't you just eat less?" I turned around and looked at him and I said, "Chris, I'm 59 years old, and I never realized that." You've given me light and understanding and don't you think if I figured that out, I wouldn't be fat? They would make it sound so simple. And it did sound simple. Don't think about those things. Same thing with bereavement issues. Think about the good stuff. Right now, I'm having trouble coming up with anything. In high school, I had a paper due, and I worked all night, I couldn't get it to come out. That morning, I had probably as close to a mental breakdown as I ever had. And I just completely lost it. Cried ceaselessly, screamed, carried on, scared my mother to death, poor woman. My mother was just a little sack of peanuts. And said, not going to school. She said, would you like me to call the pastor? And then I went on about 15 minutes speaking unkindly about the pastor. And finally went to bed. I got up later in the afternoon after sleeping and I felt fine. And of course I did, because I had a cathartic experience. And I was letting go of things that I'd been holding inside me for a very long time. And I felt so much better. That gave me a little clue as to what might be going on here. My first experience with medication wasn't with depression, it was with the tic disorder. They put me on an antihistamine called polaramine. I don't know if they use it anymore. It's a little tiny red pill that just makes you go gaga. You sit around and kind of stare off into the distance with unfocused eyes, based on the idea that I was coughing because I had drainage or something. And clearly that wasn't the issue. It would be 20 years before medication would enter the scene again. The transition for me happened when I entered seminary. I don't know if you know that in major seminaries, students are put through a number of fairly rigorous psychological tests. One of them being the major test that has been around forever is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, which asks you several hundred questions that are the strangest questions you've ever answered in your life. Somebody said after I came out of my test in seminary, well, what do you think? I said, Ed, I'm not going to ask you, but some of you may probably have taken the MMPI in the course of your life. They said, what was it like? And I said, well, evidently I'm afraid of tall women who smoke with black tarry stools. That's all I could tell. Each of us had a time of interpretation with a professor at the seminary. Mine was George Baldwin. He was an extraordinary person. And it was evening, and I ran over to a building. I was living on campus. I went over to the building, and it was just lamplight in his office, and we were talking comfortably, and he opened the MMPI, and he proceeded to tell me who I was and what I had experienced. And it was the spookiest thing I'd ever been through, because he knew me from that test. He told me about my fears, my joys, but then towards the end he set it down and he looked at me and he said, Nick, you have been hurt. I don't know how, but your energy is getting lower and lower. And if there isn't an intervention, I'm afraid of what's going to happen. And of course, he was talking about suicide. I felt so naked, so exposed, but I couldn't deny that he was absolutely right. As far as being hurt, I have no no idea what that was. I've gone back in my past. I don't think it was incidents. I think it was circumstances. But I can't really put my finger onto it, but everything else was very clear to me. And that's when I was introduced into the world of psychotherapy. The seminary had the opportunity to work with a therapist for $5 a session. Actually, the first 5 were free, and then after that, $5 a session. And I agreed to go, although it just scared the bejesus out of me. This idea of going to a counselor, you know, you might as well just stand on the street corner and say, I'm nuts. There's something really wrong with me. And I can remember going to the office, which I went to seminary in Kansas City, and this was down in the plaza. If you're familiar with Kansas City, it was the upper crust section of town and all the upper crust stores. And I went into this building, it was up on the 2nd floor. I was going to meet with a psychologist named Tom Green. And I slipped into the office, and thank God there was nobody there. It was early on a Saturday morning. And I went up to the window, and I told them who I was, and they said, take a seat, we'll let him know you're here. And then I immediately went and hid behind a pillar, so I could see the door and nobody could see me. And then I watched the parade of my fellow students coming in. One after another, a seminary student would come in and take a seat. And I was both embarrassed and relieved, because whatever this was, evidently we were all doing it together. It opened up an opportunity for me to deal with things that I didn't even know I was dealing with. And for the next 3 years, I was in therapy weekly. I learned more in therapy than I learned at the seminary. I don't say that to put down the seminary, but it was a marvelous learning experience. I did individual therapy, I was married, we did couples therapy, and we did group therapy. And I was able to look at myself from many different perspectives with some extraordinary people helping me. In that time, my psychologist asked me if I would consider taking medication. I said no. He said, why not? I said, I'm not ready for that. I just as soon not. He didn't push me. He just said, I think it can make a difference. But I didn't. I was appointed to Marion in 1979. And I've done a lot of things, not only in the parish, but I've also worked in domestic violence. I've been a therapist with a counseling agency. As you know, I've been a patient representative at a hospital. I've been a hospice chaplain. I've been the director of the spiritual care department. I've been the educator of the spiritual care department. And other things as well, and held very small parishes, those sorts of things. Well, in one of those small parishes was the pastor who had the parish previously, and we're not talking a big parish here. A good Sunday was 20 people. And you knew immediately if somebody was missing because they always sat in the same place and there was a hole when you stood up to the pulpit. Well, this pastor, who was a dear man to begin with, had suffered some tremendous losses, not the least of the death of his son to complications from HIV, his wife's death, complications of Alzheimer's. One night he went to a movie and he started to cry and he couldn't stop. And finally people came and he agreed to be allowed to allow them to take him to the psychiatric. And they did. I think it was in one night. And a few weeks later, he'd come out to this little country church, which he often did to attend worship. We were hanging around together after the service and everybody else left. I said, sit down. What was the line? And it might have sounded like I was just asking to be supportive, but I wanted information. And he told me about the experience. And he told me what it felt like. And it sounded so familiar. My heart was heavy. Also at this time, I was working in the counseling agency, basically doing educational work for companies, whatever subject they wanted presented. And I worked with the marketing director, who was just an extraordinary person. She was about 5'0". And of course, I'm 6'1". I came in one day to talk with her about what our next engagement was going to be like and how she wanted to handle it. And I don't know how she knew, but I came in through the back door and I walked into the front office and she looked at me and she said, would you like a hug? And I said, which was a little unusual for me too, I said, and she hugged me and I started to sniffle. And she whispered in my ear, you think it's time to do something? I said, yeah, I think I do. I do think it's time. And that's when I made my first appointment with a psychiatrist. Now, as scared as I was, going to counseling, going to see a psychiatrist just really freaked me out. Because I knew I would start to talk to him, and he would say, let me just get a taxi here, and we'll take a run over to St. Luke's, 2nd floor. That's what I believed. That I was crazy. Well, it turned out to be nothing like that. I talked to a nice guy. He took my history. He decided maybe this medication will help. Now here's the thing about medications. They don't always help. It's kind of hit or miss when you deal with medications. Some will help some people and not other people. And you have to sometimes try a few before you find out which ones work for you. And I did. I got some results over a course of maybe 5 or 6 different medications over the next couple of years. Some that would work and then cease to work after a year and have to try another one. But it was better than feeling hopeless and not having somebody that understood what you're struggling with. Somebody you could be honest with and you didn't have to pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't okay. Somebody who didn't run away screaming when you said, sometimes I feel like my life's not worth living. Who stayed there and smiled and nodded and didn't judge me or panicked. This went on for several years. And then my psychiatrist had to leave town, so I got a new one. And we're a good pair. He's always telling me I need to exercise and lose weight, and he's bigger than I am. I try not to roll my eyes. He's very honest and he's very conservative on medication, and so am I. He addressed, this is when I found out, I was 55 years old when I found out I had ADD. Because somebody had said to me, do you think you have ADD? Oh, I got mad. Because that was 7 years ago, I'm 62. And that was the disease du jour, adult ADD. Just as trendy as it could be. Oh, I got mad. I have ADD. said, "Do you think I have ADD?" He said, "Well, let's find out." He grabs the book off his desk. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It has all the definitions of disorders, psychiatric disorders. Flips it open and he says, "Do you have that? Do you have that? Do you act that? Do you need that? Are you like that? I answered the questions, slapped the book shut, and said, "Yep, you got it." So we ordered a new medication. It was Triptera. New non-stimulus. Didn't have a narcotic in it. I tried it for 3 weeks. I was supposed to call back and say, "How's it going?" I said, "Near as I can tell, the biggest effect is it's making it hard for me to pee. And I don't think that's what you're supposed to be experiencing." He said, "No, let's try something else." Then he moved into the stimulants. A drug called Concerta. Concerta is a scheduled drug. This frightened me, because I'd never taken anything like that before. And he prescribed a very low dose, just to see what would happen. And I remember I carried the capsule in my pocket for 2 days before I would take it. And I was on call at the hospital. And it was my Sunday to preach, do the chapel. Came to be 9 o'clock, and I was supposed to be in the chapel at 9:30, and I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I better do it. So I take out this little white capsule, 18 milligrams, not very much. I took it. I was waiting for my head to explode or something. And about 25 after, I left my office and started walking to the chapel. I suddenly realized I was relaxed. And my head wasn't whirring around, thoughts swirling in my mind. And I knew what I was going to say. And I wasn't anxious. And for the first time in probably 50 years, I wasn't depressed. That face, I was not depressed. Of course, I thought, this is a fluke. The rest of the day, this medication is time release over 12 hours. So you get 3 doses over 4 hours each. And the thing about this type of medication, at the end of the 12 hours, it's out of your body. There's no lingering effects. It's gone. The next day I got up, took my pill, went to work. Same thing. Things that I had been looking at with dread, oh Lord, I've got to do this and I've got to do that, I looked at with anticipation. They were challenges, and I knew I could do it. It was a miracle. Just a miracle. But it took me that long to figure out that the combination of the 2 drugs I was taking, one called Lexapro, which is pretty common for depression, evidently was what we call catalyzed by the Concerta. And both drugs helped each other work better. That was, I say, probably about 7 years ago. Yeah. And I can't say the effect is as strong today as it was then. It's not. But there's more to this than just finding the right medication. It's learning how to live with it. It's learning how to live with the condition. If you've been depressed all your life, and I have my bouts still, you learn how to cope with those things. And if you're doing it in isolation, not talking to anybody about it, you learn good ways and bad ways to cope with it. And you have to undo the bad learnings and capitalize on the good learnings. Just medication alone seldom is the answer. It's a help, but it's not the whole answer. So those are the things that I continue to deal with today. Is how to deal with myself with the bad habits I developed in dealing with depression, and how to encourage the good things. When we talk about depression, we're talking about a pervasive sense of uselessness, hopelessness, lack of self-esteem, negative thoughts, seeing yourself as being a phony, knowing that someday somebody's going to jump up and say, "You don't know what you're talking about." Oh my Lord, I lived with it for years. And how embarrassing that would be. Today, I would just say, "I know it." And I don't care. But this isn't something that just happens every now and then. You live with it all the time. Everybody has downtimes. Everybody experiences attributes of depression, but that may not be necessarily depression. Depression is pervasive. It's like being wrapped into a warm, wet cotton blanket. You're so far down that you don't know which way's up. You have no energy. You're paralyzed. There have been many times that I just stayed in bed, that I couldn't muster up the energy to do just the simplest of things. It is powerful. Sometimes it cycles. You get to feeling better, you get to feeling worse. And this is usually stretched out over a long period of time. It may be a type of depression called dysthymia, where the person's not incapacitated, but they're not comfortable either. They can function just fine, but they can't perform at their peak. They get full enjoyment out of the work. What we hear most common in society is manic depression. That is where a person usually gradually moves from one pole to the other. That's why we call it bipolar depression. One pole is the depressive pole, where a person experiences a major depressive episode or clinical depression. But then gradually they'll move to a manic phase, and the manic phase is characterized by an overabundance of energy, grandiose thinking. Oh, I'm going to buy this store on that corner, and I'm going to make it into this fabulously wealth-producing business. Oftentimes a person's speech will become what we call pressured. And that's like, when you put your thumb over the end of a garden hose, and you put your thumb there, and it makes the stream smaller and faster, and it tries to come out faster and faster, and it's just like you can't get everything to come out the hole like you really want it to come out. That's pressured speaking. I worked with a young woman who came to me. I'd known her since she was a little girl. She was depressed, severely depressed. I worked with her for several weeks, and I couldn't get to the root of what was going on. And the first thing I had her do was go to a psychiatrist for an evaluation. I really strongly suggest that people who are dealing with mental disorders see a psychiatrist. People don't like to do that. They want to go to their family doctor. I have nothing against family doctors, but I discourage it for mental illness. If you had something wrong with your heart, you would go to a cardiologist. If you had hay fever, you would go to, what do you call those people? Who? Allergists, yeah, I was going to say sneeze doctors, but that wasn't. This is just a specialist who knows much more about the types of drugs, their interaction Every day she'd come in, I'd give her a box of Kleenex, and she'd cry through the whole session. I checked her history and all the things that happened, and I couldn't make a connection, She'd been put on Prozac. It was about the 6th week. She came in, sat down, and she looked at me and said, I don't need the Kleenex. I said, why not? I said, I don't feel sad. I said, you can't. She said, everything's different. The Prozac finally kicked in. Depression is not the end of the world. It's just not. Like any other serious illness, and it is a serious illness, it's not going to stop on a dime. It requires time and attention and support. We still have a heck of a time talking about these things, revealing our own weaknesses, or what are seen as weaknesses, what we consider to be our shortcomings, our helplessness. And there's reasons for that, because in a lot of places still, it's not well received. Depression is no different than diabetes, which I also have. It is typically chemical imbalance in the brain. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front. Do they know why people become depressed? No. They have a lot of ideas, but they don't know for sure how it happens. Way back, many hundreds of years and thousands of years ago, when people became depressed, they would carve a hole in their head. It's called trephining. They had tools that would bore through the skull and make an opening. There are people that still do that today. They think it makes them smarter. I don't think boring a head in your hole in your head is an indication of being smarter. Just my opinion. But some people got better. Go figure. Through the years, there were all types of attempts to deal with depression. There was one unfortunate period in history not too long ago in the 40s and 50s. The frontal lobotomy. Man made a lot of money on that, doing frontal lobotomies, one man. Many doctors did back then, but it became commonly accepted. It was simple, and it did produce some results. I don't mean to gross you out, but I think it's important that you understand how this was done. The person was given sedation, and the instrument, similar to an ice pick, was placed in the corner of the eye and punched through to the base of the brain. There's not that much to go through. So basically what we've got is ice pick at brain. And where it came out was behind the prefrontal cortex. And there's connections in there. And with the proper instrument, they go up in there and gently switch. Couldn't see it. Didn't know what they were doing. But they would break the connections, any of the connections between the frontal and the back of the brain. For people who were psychotic, people who were schizophrenic, people who were depressed. And some of these people showed marked improvement. They didn't know why. Unfortunately, most of these people were severely damaged and lived their lives with bland personalities, deficits in cognitive ability, could never be alone again. Because somebody thought they found the answer to everything. Medication was being used in the 50s. electroshock is still here today because in many cases it is effective. Very effective. But it's the course of last resort. It's simply, well, there's three different things today. It used to be just shooting voltage across the brain. People were not prepared properly. It basically would cause a severe seizure. People would actually break bones because of reflection in the body. They would wake up and ears of their memory would be erased. Teeth would be chipped, bite their tongues. It's pretty gruesome. Today, ECT is still practiced for people who seem to have intractable depression. I had a client I was working with, she's had over 60 treatments. And frankly, I don't see any deficits in her and some. But when you have an ECT today, you come in, you're given a sedative, and you're given muscle relaxant, except for your foot. Tourniquets are around. The whole procedure takes about 20 minutes. They just sat you. And the doctor is watching your foot to see if it's wiggling. That tells you how long the seizure is going. They want it to be hopefully between 30 and 40 seconds. Then the person is allowed to come out of sedation. And in a few hours, they're up running around. Okay. For some people, they're in miraculous results. One treatment, huge difference. For other people, it's taken many, many years to get into results. There certainly isn't the danger as it was in the past. Again, they don't know why. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm sitting here holding the microphone. Jeez, talk about distracting. They don't know why this happens. The best guess is that the seizure kind of hits the reset button. And in some way that starts things going back into proper function. But nobody knows for 100% sure. Of course, medications have been around for a long time. The earliest medications were called the tricyclics. Tricyclics were kind of dangerous drugs, and they needed to be taken with extreme caution because too much in the bloodstream could cause severe problems. So you had to be monitored with that, and you had to be careful with allergies or reactions with other drugs. Then came monooxidase inhibitors. A little different way of functioning, better than the tricyclics, but still not the safest drugs in the world. But effective with some people. And, oh, thank you. It's a heavy microphone. Just such a little guy. And then came the advent of a lot of other drugs in the 60s. People were using diazepam, Valium, Elavil, a bunch of other mood enhancers. My mother was addicted to several of them. She was addicted until the day she died to Valium. I forgot to tell you, she was a person who took her own life at 72. But they serve their purpose if they're used properly and under supervision. What she was doing was going to different doctors and not telling them about the other doctors she was seeing, so she would get prescriptions. And she was mixing them. Then, in, I believe, the 90s, we saw the advent of the SSRI drug. And to explain that, I'm going to give you just a little theory. Again, remember, we don't know for sure what's causing depression. But researchers began to believe that it had something to do with the soup in our brains that helps information to be transferred. By that I mean there are chemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters. We have brain cells that are called neurons, and they communicate with each other. But they don't touch. They're very close to each other because there's a little ion gap, they call it, between them. And in order to get the messages across, these brain transmitters have to be secreted at the proper time and be there during the transfer of information and then taken up so they no longer affect that gap. And what they found was, in people with depression, it kind of looked like those secretions were disappearing too quickly. They didn't hang around long enough to make a difference. So, a whole group of chemicals began to be developed. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And simply what they did is caused one of those neurotransmitters called serotonin to hang around a little bit longer. And there was evidence to show that it helped people. And those are most of the drugs that I've been on through my lifetime. Better portion of my lifetime. Probably 6 or 7. I've never stopped and counted. And to this day, and I must emphasize, I still don't know for sure why it works. Just like the ECT or electroshock therapy, they don't know why it works. Thank God they don't do anything like a lobotomy anymore. So we're still learning, but in the midst of learning, we're making progress. I can swear to you, we're making progress. My life is so much better today. So much better. And that's because of two things. And I think when people are dealing with depression, I'm pretty strong in this. There are the options of medication and the options of psychotherapy, talk therapy. It is my belief that you need both. Because you need to address a biochemical issue like diabetes. I take my insulin low sometimes. And I don't apologize to anybody for that, because my pancreas is kaput. I don't feel ashamed. Why the heck should I be ashamed because I need a bump in serotonin in my brain? It's no different. I'm not crazy. Well, I can get pretty strange sometimes, but I'm not crazy. Once my mentor and dear friend, who was the senior pastor, was the director of spiritual care before I was, unfortunately, he died. And somebody had said to me as a critique that I get scary. And I don't perceive myself as scary. Inside, I'm just a big marshmallow. I am. People have called me teddy bear for many years. It is true. You know, I might get kind of crusty inside of a teddy bear. I said, I'm not scary. And my dear friend, who was also unfortunately very honest with me, said, you do get kind of a wild look in your eye when you're passionate about something. It's always good to have feedback. The talking helps us deal with the experience of dealing with depression, which is a burden in and of itself. It helps us deal with our feelings of guilt, which are unjustified. It helps us deal with feelings of being cheated. Why me? And it helps us deal with the habits that we develop to try and hide or compensate for it. It gives us the tools to understand what we're going through. And some self-respect. This ain't no picnic. This is no picnic. And nothing you need to be ashamed of. Both, I think, are essential in helping us achieve the life that brings us satisfaction and to accept ourselves and others as we are. Now, finally, what I want to talk about is issues of faith, spirituality, if you will. When we talk about the church and how the church deals with something, of course, you know, we're talking about us. We're not talking about the building. We're not talking about the administration or finances or anything like that. We're talking about us, the people. That's what church means, ecclesios. Ecclesios? I'm not a Greek scholar. The people. How can we respond to this? Well, I remember at Kenny's funeral, I knew I had to say something because Kenny was a big dumb Swede. You know, Swedes, outgoing Swedes, you know how you can tell them. They look at the other guy's shoes when they meet instead of at their own. Swedes won't tell you anything. Right, Jackie?
Yeah, I think so.
And if you've got a problem, well, there, you don't be talking about that there to other people.
Yeah, sure.
And Kenny wouldn't be a person that would talk to other people about that. So he suffered in silence. Unfortunately, his family suffered in silence. We need to be a place and a time where people can come to us before they get so sick. And to know that they can come and trust, and that their decision-making process is not going to be stripped from them. And that we're supporting persons who aren't going to tell them what their experiences are, but listen to them. We're going to be like Jesus. As he moved among the outcasts of the city, lepers, demoniacs, who were probably people who were suffering from mental illnesses, and how he was gracious to them and loving towards them, where other people were calling them unclean and abandoning them in the graveyards and other places that were very unpleasant, reserved for them. We, in the Spirit of Christ, invite people who struggle to come into the community. Doesn't mean we can always deal with everything, but it's a starting place. We fight hard within ourselves to get over the stigma and the prejudices that we may hold. You see, back in Jesus' time, if a person experienced problems, if they were lame, blind, it was commonly believed that that happened to them for a reason. They were being punished for their own behavior or for their parents' behavior. Remember, Jesus came upon the blind man and the lame man. I don't know. And one of the disciples said, "Master, for why is this person suffering? Was it his doing or was it his parents' doing?" Jesus said, "God makes the rain to fall upon the good and the bad." That was really sophisticated for that time. Because most everybody else would have said, well, I don't know who screwed up, but it must have been pretty bad. We don't believe that today. Because we know about the grace of Christ. And we know all of us are deserving of it. And that no one should be vilified for those things they have no control over, but rather held in compassion and growing understanding. We need to provide that. We need to be careful of what we do to our people who are underrepresented and may be underserved and may be easily victimized. And these are the elderly, those who are ill, those who struggle with the illness, the medical condition of addiction. Those who cannot find the way out of the darkness of depression. To let them know that they are not unacceptable. To remember the words of Martin Luther, there but for the grace of God go I. And probably will at some point in life. Dealing with people who struggle in these issues, there is no place for judgment. There's a need to slow down and quit trying to get to the happy ending fast. Because they're not capable of that. It takes time. And growing understanding. We need to be able to sit in their anxiety and their uncertainty. Without answers. I've always told people that chaplaincy, healthcare chaplaincy, is about occupying the place of no answers. Where we offer our presence and love to people who are struggling. Last night I went to the visitation of a young man who killed himself. An infantry person, medic, who couldn't stand it anymore and killed himself. His mother was a co-worker. I knew the boy a little bit. And as I went through the line, even after years and years and years, I still think, what can I say? What can I say? And I got to her, I hugged her, and she whispered in my ear, I'm so glad you're here. I said, I wish there was something I could say that would make this all better. I don't have any. And it was, I think, the best thing I could say. Because I was not trying to snow her on with, oh, it's going to get better, and God has a reason for this, and blah, blah, blah. I was touching her reality, even though I couldn't know what it was like. And basically saying to her, excuse the language, this sucks. And that's the reality of the life. We need to do that for our brothers and sisters who struggle. Even if we don't have the ultimate answer, because we probably never will. But we can let them know they're not alone. And that we love them. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful message. I do want to offer an opportunity for those of you who have questions, and if you wrote them down, that's fine, but now that we've concluded Nick's remarks, you can just popcorn them out. Also, Nora's passing around a flyer about our next event, which is going to be in May. You also have information on the handout that you got when you came in. I would remind you that we would like feedback and other ideas for continuing education, community education. On that evaluation sheet with this tear-off slip is to remind you about our May event and our September event. So who has a question for Nick? Oh my goodness.
That's if Jesus and Superman had a fight again.
Oh,
Oh, I explained it all perfectly. That's good. I'm glad to see that. Yes, ma'am.
Would depression be hereditary?
Yes,
It would be.
thank you. That was very important. But not always. There are times when people experience major depression episodes and there is no indication of that in the family. Now, my personal belief is that somebody's lying. But, it's like 95% of families experience some type of depression, the other 5% are just a bunch of liars. But, yes, it is hereditary. I do believe that. Not only depression, but other types of disorders. Obsessive compulsive disorder. Well, a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, I've always been curious for a long time.
Yep. They're very much a genetic condition. My mother finally admitted to me that she was obsessive compulsive. I already knew she was depressive, but she was a counter. She was a person that would count the squares on the wall or turn on switches a certain number of times and turn them off. And of course, lucky me, I got some of that. Yes?
I struggle with the fact is, one of my children has a severe depression problem, and I never know whether to ask or not to ask how things are going, because I don't think you're going to find out otherwise. And my job is to worry. I know that. So, sometimes he's very nice and says, "I'm doing okay, Mom," and then other times he'll say, "You don't need to ask. I can take care of myself." And how do you like to be communicated to know how things are going for you?
The question is, with the child, it's a dicey thing to ask, "How are you doing today?" Because sometimes he'll accept it, okay, and other times it's back off. I don't want to talk about it. Myself, if I don't want to tell anybody anything, I won't. I have coworkers. It's very hard for me because I want to be the caretaker. I don't want to be the taken care of, just like everybody else. It's much easier to take care of other people than it is to be taken care of, even if we really need it bad. When coworkers come to me, friends come to me and say, "Well, how's it going?" Sometimes I'll tell them, and sometimes I'll just kind of soft pedal it if I want to. I believe everybody has a right to do that. I think the goal with family members is that outside of just asking them what's going on, building the kind of relationship that when the chips are down, there's a better than good chance that they will come to you. Because you can't guarantee that everything they say to you is the truth. You can't guarantee that with anybody. And you can't guarantee that you can change what they're experiencing rather than that. The most we offer typically is understanding and support, and sometimes just "I'm sorry." That makes sense.
Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
How old was you when you started there?
When I started therapy, let's see, about 24, 25. In a perfect world, that should have happened 10 years earlier. But, yeah.
And have you related this to, and I've heard several people talk about, when the crops go in and when the crops comes out is the worst times for depression?
I find the spring and the fall can be very difficult. I don't know if it's what it's associated with. I talk to people in human service and also in the medical field, and they tend to agree that the fall and the spring is higher for deaths. nobody's ever researched that, we don't really know. But I think when it makes sense when you look at the enormous challenge that is involved with putting crops in and taking crops out. If a person doesn't have the energy, if they don't feel like they can do the job they've been doing for 30 or 40 years, they may feel like a failure. It may seem like, I've lost it, I can't do it anymore, and this is who I am, and I can no longer do it. One can begin to understand what the connection would be between suicide at those times of fear and depression.
Your three kinds of therapy was therapy.
Therapy, medication,
And electrostatic.
and what was the last?
Electric.
Oh, yeah, electroshock is the last resort. That's not something that people who are seeking help should think about, because nobody's going to say to you, well, it's nice to meet you. Let's shoot a few thousand bullets across your brain. It's not going to happen. They're going to try the medications that are available at this time.
I think I went back when I had a nervous breakdown, and I went through insulin.
Oh, thank you, because I knew I was going to say something else. Insulin shock is an alternative to electroshock, and that's just where they overload a person on insulin under a doctor's supervision, and that causes a seizure. There's a third one, I'm going to forget the name of it, but basically it's similar to a magnetic resonance imaging. They use magnetism to stimulate the cortex of the brain. It's not as violent as electroshock, and they've been having some good results with that, and that's a very recent development.
In addition to those forms of therapy, we do offer a course here periodically called Therapeutic Lifestyle Change, where we talk about healthy behaviors, and it makes kind of an accountability group, and people learn to improve their diet, take special nutritional supplements that are geared for brain health, exercise, sleep, social interactions, and there's 6 different healthy behaviors that are good for anybody, but that is another way to augment other forms of therapy.
Repetitive transcranial stimulation. That's what that's called. Others?
Any other
Yes,
questions?
ma'am.
Are other addictions kind of a cover-up for depression, like alcoholism, shopping?
It is not unusual to my understanding, and I'm not an addictions therapist, but that if you scratch the surface of an addiction, you'll find another mental illness. Schizophrenia, depression, significant loss issues. I've discovered that myself. Yes, oftentimes chemical use is an attempt to self-medicate for another condition. Yeah. Owen? God bless you.